Hello, this is Dr. Manuel Saldivar. This is a short presentation on one lesson that I use in my UNIV 1301 course. I have been using this lesson for a couple semesters now. It is based on Chapter 8 of a textbook by Dembo and Selly. The textbook is entitled Motivation and Learning Strategies for College Success. The content in this chapter covers strategies that students and learners can use to maximize their learning from written materials. So the readings, whether it's from a textbook, scholarly article, website, whatever kinds of readings, textual materials might be assigned to students to help them prepare for in-class lecture, activity, discussion. So that's the big topic that's covered in the chapter. The specific idea that I talk about in this lesson is the concept of alternative representations of knowledge, which is simply the idea of taking information that's presented in one form, in this case in a textual form, and altering or reconfiguring that information into another form, a visual form, to help us have alternative representations, to help us have different ways of thinking about the same material. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, and I'm familiar with the literature in this area. I know we have a lot of evidence going back for decades that one of the best ways to ensure that we are developing a true understanding of an idea or a concept, as opposed to just kind of a surface level rote understanding, to have a deep understanding, we need to be able to develop alternative representations, to take an idea or a concept that's presented to us in some form, let's say a textual form, as in this case, and then change it into a different form. That ability to take an idea or a concept that's presented in one fashion, a written or textual fashion, let's say, and then break it apart and put it back together as a visual representation, as an oral explanation in another example, or some other kind of representation. The act of doing that is a good way for us to demonstrate our ability to master that concept, to have a true understanding of the concept. So the way that I begin this lesson, then, again, students will have already read the reading in advance, so they'll have the background knowledge on the concept, is first by addressing a question that a lot of students bring up with more or less diplomacy, which is, because many of them have never really encountered this concept before, I'll have students say more or less politely, well, okay, this alternative representation stuff, yeah, it's interesting, I read the textbook, blah, blah, but at the end of the day, it's kind of nerdy professor stuff. Real students don't really do that because it's just kind of, so much work. Why do you spend all that time? Well, for many years, I struggled with how to counter that argument in a cogent way. And then last year, it was actually a student who unknowingly perhaps helped me make a better argument. So I follow UTRGV's Snapchat feed in my never-ending quest to try and understand my students better. And I noticed this post by a student on Snapchat, on the RGV Snapchat feed. Now here you can see the student, I guess, is lamenting that they spilled water, it looks like, on their notes. But then I looked at the notes more closely, and I realized that this was indeed a real live student out in the wild using a visual representation of information. This looks like from an American history or perhaps world history class. It looks like a sequence or a progression kind of representation. And so now when I teach this lesson, I include these images to let students know, hey, this actually is something that real students do. It's not just nerdy PhD types like me that are trying to lecture you about how to do things. Students like you use this approach. And if you do too, I believe you would be, I tell them, I believe you would be maximizing your learning. Now, to begin the activity, and again, students will have read about these concepts in more detail in the reading. This Chapter 8 from this Dembo and Selly textbook talks about three major categories of representation. A progression on the far left here is basically a procedure or a series of steps that can be visualized: step 1, step 2, step 3. A hierarchy is a representation where we have an idea or a concept that is then broken down into subsidiary concepts or ideas. And then finally, a matrix is when two or more things, concepts, ideas, theories, individuals, what have you, are compared in some way according to multiple dimensions or variables. So in this case, that sample matrix has 2 rows, so I'm comparing 2 things, whatever the things are, according to characteristic A, characteristic B, characteristic C. And so then basically the lesson is I will present students with a block of text like this. This happens to, all of these actually come from a text by Curran Dubois from '98 entitled Learning to Learn, which is a great text that I recommend if you're interested in these kinds of topics. And so I have students, and they have a worksheet in front of them that gives them a little bit of additional scaffolding. I'm not going to include that in this presentation, but suffice to say they have this text in front of them and a little bit of guidance from a worksheet. And the point, or the goal, is for them to take this textual information and turn it into something that looks like this. In this case, obviously this is a hierarchy. So the human nervous system is divided into, according to the text, the central nervous system, brain spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which has cranial and spinal nerves, afferent and efferent nerves, etc., etc. And so my kind of, the point I make to drive this home with students is, imagine you've got 15 minutes before a big midterm, a big final in your biology class or psychology class or wherever you would have this kind of content. You're sitting there in the classroom waiting for the professor to come in, start the test. In that finite amount of time, what would you rather have in front of you to be able to help you review in those last few minutes? A big block of text or this representation? And most students, I think, would prefer to have a representation. I give them an additional block of text, in this case looking at college choices. This is all fictional information, but I tell them once they go through this process, in this case they're going to create a matrix, not a hierarchy. But again, I'll ask them, if you're reviewing for a test, would you rather have this block of pretty dense content, or would you rather have this matrix? Would you rather have this block of context? This is the third and final sample or content that I give them. Would you rather have this information or this nice little chart that kind of is easier to scan, easier to read, but still gives you a meaningful understanding of how these ideas relate one to another? This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.